Okay, so welcome everyone. We are thrilled for you to join us today. Chandra, if you want to advance to the next slide, please. Welcome to the webcast this morning called Supporting Families of Young Children at Risk for Ongoing Domestic Violence, the first webinar in a four-part series with the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health, focused on preventing and responding to family violence during COVID-19. My name is Alicia Welch, and I'm the Program Administrator for the South Southwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or MHTTC for short. I'm joined today by my colleagues Holly Gerslin and Molly Lopez, who are working behind the scenes to make sure everything runs smoothly. We're thrilled to be co-hosting today's event with our colleagues at the National Network Coordinating Office, and would like to thank the amazing MHTTC team who helped plan this series. I'll explain more about the MHTTC network in a bit, but first I'd also like to thank our wonderful presenters, Dr. Chandra, Ghosh, Ippen, and Dr. Carla Stover for sharing your expertise on today's webinar and for the time you've spent today planning today's event. And a big thanks to you all for joining us. We hope you'll find today's presentation helpful to you in your practice. Next slide, please. Just a few housekeeping items that we want you to know. We've made every attempt to make today's presentation secure. If we need to end the presentation unexpectedly for any reason, we'll follow up using your registration information. All attendees, as I mentioned in the very beginning, are muted and cannot share your video. But if you have a question for the presenters, please use the Q&A pod that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Or if you have a comment or a link that you'd like to share with attendees, please use the chat box. As I said, my colleagues and I will be monitoring both of those throughout the event and will reply imminently. The recording of today's session and the slide deck our speakers will use will be posted on our website within a few days. You'll receive an email following the presentation on how to access a certificate of attendance as well. And if you don't already, please follow us on social media and stay in touch with us. Next slide, please. We go next slide. Sorry, thank you.
I did. Did it not show up?
It just did. Yeah, thank you. For those who are new to the MHTTC network, the network accelerates the adoption and implementation of mental health related evidence-based practices across the nation. We develop and disseminate resources and provide free local and regional training and technical assistance for the mental health workforce. Next slide. Here's our lovely map displaying the centers that make up the entire MHTTC network. We have 10 regional centers highlighted in the various colors, as well as a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center and a National Hispanic and Latino Center, as well as the National Network Coordinating Office housed in California. After this presentation, please visit our website and find your center so that you may stay up to date on trainings and resources offered in your region. Next slide, please. We also wanted to highlight just the South Southwest region for you for a minute, which you can see on this map. Includes 5 states: Arkansas, Louisiana, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas, and 70 plus tribal communities. We also wanted to make a shameless plug for a virtual conference on first episode psychosis that we're hosting August 3rd through 5th. If you're interested, please visit the registration link that you see here. We've included it here, and as well, you can visit our website for more information. Next slide, please. As I indicated earlier, today's event is part of a larger webinar series that the MHTTC network is hosting with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Here are the dates and times for the rest of the events in the series, and encourage you to register. We'll provide you these dates at the end of today's event as well. The next slide, please. A quick disclaimer, this presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, also known as SAMHSA. The opinions expressed in the presentation are the views of our speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. Next slide, please. As part of receiving SAMHSA funding, we're required to submit data related to the quality of the event. At the end of today's training, we ask that you please take a moment to complete a brief survey about today's session. We will display this link and the QR code that you see here on the screen at the end of the event as well, but we wanted to flag that for you now so you know it's coming. Next slide, please. Okay, so now that we got that out of the way, let's start with today's event, supporting families of young children at risk for ongoing domestic violence. Next slide, please. We are thrilled to introduce our two presenters to you today, Dr. Chandra Ghosh Ippen and Dr. Carla Stover. Dr. Ghosh Ippen is the Associate Director and Dissemination Director of the Child Trauma Research Program at the University of California, San Francisco, and the Early Trauma Treatment Network, which is a member of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Chandra has a wealth of experience in treatment outcome research on the effectiveness of psychosocial intervention programs with Spanish-speaking children and parents, and is committed to examining how culture and context affect perception and mental health systems. Dr. Carla Stover is a licensed clinical psychologist and associate professor at the Yale Child Study Center. Her clinical work has focused on responses to families impacted by violence, including long-term evidence-based treatments. She also developed an intervention for fathers with histories of use of family violence and is currently evaluating its effectiveness. We are thrilled to have them here today, excited to provide a space for all of us to learn from them today. So without further ado, I will turn it over to them. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Carla and I are honored to be here with you. We both represent two evidence-based interventions that are relationship-based, focused on addressing violence in families with young children, and committed to integrating fathers into treatment whenever possible. And we've included some links where you can look up our interventions here. As we talk to you today, you'll be hearing a bit about how our understanding of trauma theory and our evidence-based models inform the way that we think about family violence and also the way that we intervene. And we'll be highlighting that trauma-informed practice and culturally responsive care require that we acknowledge historical trauma, biases, and disparities within systems, and that we always think about how we engage and work with families in light of long-standing histories of injustices, injustices within our systems and also within our country. The way that we work incorporates an ecological framework that looks at risk and protective factors at multiple levels. So working from right to left, we can think about the risk and protective factors residing within the individual, within close family relationships, and then very importantly, within our community and society. And as we've highlighted, we really always need to be aware of structural inequities that can affect families and the way that we work with families. And I wanted to quickly share a metaphor. So if you think of the family at the center and the community and society outside of the family, think about what happens when there is pressure squeezing the family. Pressure from COVID, pressure from racism, pressure from mass incarceration, police violence. And the metaphor really is, if you squeeze somebody from the outside hard enough, it is unfortunate, but it is likely that they will pop. And that is one of the ways that we think about the context of family violence. And we're, of course, always going to be looking at danger and safety within the individual circle that's closest to the kid. But it would really be a miss if we're not looking at how the larger system is affecting family relationships and stress. So today, Carla and I will be talking with you about a family. And as we do this, we hope to shine a spotlight on three core concepts from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network core curriculum on childhood trauma. The first is to really think about the broader context around family violence, and we've already started to do this. And then to think about how we think about and address danger and safety when we're working with families around family violence and when we think about young children. And then we'll be thinking constantly about the way that we adopt a diversity-informed perspective and an anti-racist stance in the way that we understand and work with families. And so now I'm going to turn this over to Carla, who will start talking to us about the family.
Hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be here today, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about a family to try to set the context for the things we're going to talk about today, because we always feel like it's better to talk about an actual case and a family to think about the concepts and make them come to life in a different kind of way. So I'm going to tell you about James, who's 42, and Marisol, 38. They're a married couple. The referral came in that they were both drinking, and an argument ensued, and the argument escalated to fighting that was yelling and screaming, and James grabbed and pushed Marisol down on the ground. The police were called by Marisol's older daughter, and there was a 19-month-old, their shared daughter Kaya, who was in the room at the time of the incident, and it was unclear how or in what way she was involved in the incident. James was arrested, and child protection was notified because Kaya was present at the time of the incident. Following his arrest, a limited protective order was put in place that allowed him to come back to the house and still have contact with the family. Next slide. So assuming that you received this referral for a case that you were going to be working with, in the chat box, put some of your immediate concerns or thoughts that you have about the case. So what things come to mind immediately? Concern for the children, okay. Drinking, safety, the drinking, safety for the kids, coming fast and furious. Financial impact on the family. Is there a pattern? What co-occurring issues are there? The oldest daughter, providing safety, effects on the 14-year-old. Are there weapons in the home? Drugs. Safety for both of the children. Trauma effects on the family. Both daughters' mental health.
Is this a recurring pattern?
It is, yes, yes. So it seems like a lot of the same kinds of patterns. The history. So it sounds like people are really concerned about the trauma on the kids, about the safety, about the mental health of the kids, what outside supports are there, if there's weapons in the home. I'm sorry if there's a lot of them. So what supportive factors there are. Has this happened before? How much have the kids seen? These are good. These are really good. Socioeconomic background. Does the family have a big enough home? Stress factors related to income and poverty, family connections, options for placement if needed. Is mom open to receiving assistance or services? Past involvement with child services? Underlying issues. Okay, good. Oh, something about dad there that I missed. Immigration status. How's this? Okay. All right. For those of you looking at the chat box, it goes really fast, so I was trying to read out a lot of them, but there's a lot of recurring themes there in terms of thinking about the background. So now let me give you a little bit more information. So you got the referral piece, right? Like what often comes through on a referral form. So now if you think about what pictures and images come to mind when you learn this additional information. So you learn some more about James, that he's an African-American man. He grew up in housing projects in a lower income home. His father was abusive. He served 6 years in jail, in prison, due to drug and burglary related charges. And he also has a 17-year-old daughter who he's not seen in a year, who doesn't currently have contact with. You learn about Marisol that she's a Puerto Rican mother. She has 2 older children from 2 different relationships, as well as the 19-month-old Kaya that she shares with James. And she is previously diagnosed with and has been treated for PTSD. So I'd like you to just think for a minute about what pictures or images come to mind when you hear about that information. And let's just pause and think about what potential biases and assumptions we might have about this family, just based on this written information that we've received. Limited education, biased against James for being incarcerated previously. Reminds me of ACEs and the impact, low income, family stress, racial bias, alcohol issues, instability, cultural differences, mom having several past relationships, racial bias due to his history. Good. These are excellent. So I think that what we have to think about whenever we get a referral is that we have to think about what are our immediate images of a family? What are our immediate thoughts about a case before we even meet the family, before we even start to think about what it'll be like to work with them? Chandra, do you have anything you want to add about that?
No, I'm just really glad that people are really addressing our potential biases when we hear that he's been incarcerated. And what we know is that it's important to fight those, especially because what we know is that many times people of color, African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos, are jailed at higher rates for similar crimes of substance use. And so we really want to give him a chance to talk to us about what happened. And also the question is he talking to us? Our minds also often create pictures of father was abusive, living in a housing project. And again, when we work with people, what they've told us is about love there, about confusion sometimes, that your dad, what is the story behind his dad? How would we hear that? How does the way that James has metabolized his family history and his story about his dad, how does that affect kind of the way that he relates to his children? Other people also talked about Marisol, about any biases that we might have when we think about a mom with multiple relationships and multiple children. And again, being very aware of that so that we can fight our own biases and really meet the family and hear their story.
Right. Good. Right. So I think there is our images, and I do a lot of work with fathers and work with a lot of clinicians. And I think when a case is referred and there's history of jail by the father, he talks about street life. You know, images come to mind about what it's going to be like to work with him that are there before we even meet him. And that's important for us to be aware and acknowledge those. So let's hear a little bit more about what we learn about James and Marisol from the intake interview. So you got the information on the referral form, and now we're going to learn what it was like when you actually meet them and get some information during intake. So we have this couple has actually been together for 3 years. They've been married for 2 years. They met when James was doing repairs on the condo that Marisol was renting. And James is currently on parole. Marisol, as I said, has a 14-year-old daughter. She also has a 21-year-old daughter from 2 previous relationships, and the 14-year-old resides with them. She describes the previous relationships with the other fathers as toxic. And she doesn't really have a lot of contact with them now. Pregnancy with Kaya was unplanned and it was high risk, but both parents actually report being very happy about having another child. James was raised in a violent home. His father was a drug addict. He was very, oops, can you go back one? Thank you. He was physically violent toward James and his mother and siblings. He had no prior mental health treatment. When he was incarcerated, he did attend an anger management and parenting class while he was there. Marisol was sexually abused as a child, and she has had previous treatment for her PTSD a couple of years ago that she reports as helpful. Okay, next slide. Oops, I feel like these are going quickly. So in terms of thinking about, so that's a little bit more information about the parents. The assessment, and both parents report that this is a first-time incident. They haven't been violent with each other before in their current relationship. In terms of the assessment of their daughter, Kaya, so we're just going to focus on her since this is a webinar about young children, although we recognize that there's also a 14-year-old in the house. So the 19-month-old, from the assessment of her, she actually is eating and sleeping well, according to the parents. You know, she's sleeping and eating about as much as we would expect for a child of her age. She's meeting her developmental milestones within normal limits. She's walking. She has some language, mostly single words, but starting to say a few words together. And she really likes to play a lot, and she's very interactive, but she often kicks and throws toys when she plays. And when we think about assessment of a young child, right, we want to think about what are the developmental impacts of witnessing violence? What are some of the symptoms we may be looking for? Marisol, you would be looking for developmental delays possibly, or not meeting developmental milestones, which she is meeting those. She is sleeping and eating well, which is something else we would be concerned would be disrupted. But we'd also be looking for behavioral concerns, right? So the kicking and throwing of toys, could be a sign of some behavioral issues, some some things that she's observed in terms of witnessing aggression or violence in the home, or just difficulty managing affect, and she's not getting the kind of support around that that she might need. So then we might also be looking for hyperarousal, fear, any repetitive play that looks like it might be similar to the incident. Those are the kinds of things that we'd be looking for in terms of, are we worried about symptoms for Kaya? And as well as the relational issues with the parents. How is she interacting with mom? How is she interacting with dad? What is her attachment with both of those, of her parents as well? Next slide. All right, Chandra.
So when we go to see how how James is playing with Kaya, what we see is that they actually have a lovely and warm relationship. The Kaya is really comfortable with her dad. She crawls on his lap. She hugs him. She plays close to him. And this is one of the things that we typically want to do, is to do a good, solid observation of what they look like together. We would also want to see Kaya with Marisol. And we would be thinking about, actually, often with family violence, we also see caregiver depression. This is actually, as we learned more about the family, this is a family where actually Marisol and James were quite open in the fact that they both used to fight, and that Marisol would also sometimes hit. And that is really important to think about, because somebody actually put in the chat that one of our biases might be seeing Marisol as a victim. And that in this particular event, James did push her down, and that is something that Kaya witnessed. It wasn't something that was happening frequently, but we'll think about the stressors that led to this particular event in their story. But in this particular family, we see very good interactions between the parents and the kids. And we see that, James at times takes charge of her play. He's trying to get her to name the colors of the blocks. And what we would be really aware of is he's being watched. And so in some ways, in child development, we often think about parents really following the child's play, and yet we'd also be thinking about how he's really teaching her things. He's teaching her colors, he's teaching her the names, and we see a little bit of that throwing blocks or knocking them down when they're playing. And we'd be thinking, well, this could be typical for a toddler. She's 19 months old. When we think about her play, we'd be thinking about, what do the parents think about what's happening? How often does it happen? How do they typically respond? We might also be holding a mantra that trauma exacerbates normal developmental challenges. So one of the normal developmental challenges in toddlerhood is that when you get angry, you have to learn what to do with those angry feelings. You have to learn what to do when you're frustrated. And in this particular family, we know that at least once they have seen this happen. They've seen that when people get angry, sometimes people push and shove. And one of our questions back to the family would be, even though Kaya's doing really well, she's seen this. And what do they think about that? And this idea of, how would you like Kaya to understand that at least this one time that we know of, and maybe they'll tell us about more if they trust us, but at least this one time she saw this, and how would they like her to understand that people got angry and this happened? And are they tracking that she saw this?
So when we think about this case and what we've, the amount that we've told you about it at least, we want to be thinking about safety planning and what would be the possible intervention approaches with this particular family. So we want to think first, obviously, about strategizing for safety. So we have heard about this one incident that was dangerous for the family, that Kaya was involved. Police were called by the older daughter. So there was some level of fear about what was happening in the context of that particular argument and that particular incident. And so we want to think about, what is the level of risk? How do we assess the level of risk for a particular family? And what are the sources of that risk, right? So if we think about, with this particular case, we're not hearing from either parent about a long history of very violent episodes. We are hearing about what I would call more situational violence that's happening in the context of the parents getting into heated arguments and having reactivity. Still dangerous, still worrisome, but a different kind of violence than maybe another kind of case where dad is using a lot of power and control and manipulating and controlling mother and terrorizing the household. You're seeing that there's nice father-child relationship when the child is clearly connected to the dad, feels comfortable, is not fearful of him in the play observation. The family very much wants to be together, and the mother really has no intention of ending the relationship, doesn't want to end the relationship. So the sources of risk are more around the stress level of the family in terms of what's happening in the context of their lives at present, which we're going to come back to in a minute. We also want to consider the family context and what potential consequences might come of whatever plans we develop, right? So how are we focusing on victim-focused advocacy with, if we're seeing this case as the mom as the victim, which we often do, right? Mom as a victim. In this particular incident, she was pushed down. She's considered the victim. The father was arrested. And in other cases, similarly, where we have this assessment of mom as the victim, how are we focusing on advocacy for her and not service-focused advocacy? So often systems we come in, we have this particular, map of what we do. We go in, we ask these questions, and then, oh, this happens, we call this number, or we give mom this referral, and now we're all done there, that we've done our due diligence, rather than really listening to what the mother wants and what it is that she would find helpful and what is she asking for. And so that we really want to be thinking about that with each family we serve. What's the particular context that they're in, and what's going to be focused on their particular needs. And think through, I think particularly right now in the context of the pandemic and the way the systems are functioning, but even in other times, what is the consequences of making another call to Child Protective Services? If you're worried, and you make another call to Child Protective Services, what happens? So I can share, what's happening now in my state in Connecticut. If a father is told he can't be in the house, there's no opportunity for supervised visits by DCF. There's no home-based in-person visits because the system is not doing those right now because of the pandemic. So I have dads who haven't seen their kids in 3 or 4 months or longer because there was a protective order in place. The courts have been closed. DCF's not offering supervised visits. So they've seen their kids by video only, if at all. And so very painful for families and for a little girl like this, a 19-month-old who is very attached to her father, to then potentially not see him for a long period of time would be damaging in my view. So we want to then think about, so what are the consequences, right? And also not only the consequences of a system intervention like that, but also what are the consequences of the way you approach the mom about what's happening, and is it safe for her to be in the house, and should she leave or should dad leave? If that's not what she's really interested in and she's not feeling that level of concern or lack of safety, really thinking through, like, is that, not that you can't make those suggestions or think it through, but how are you presenting it to her? How are you thinking about safety planning in a way that feels like you're really considering her point of view and not just saying, oh, well, here's the resources, here's the number to the domestic violence hotline, here's the shelter, here's how you contact the shelter, which she may not experience as helpful, or that you'll think that if she doesn't leave him, then you can't help her. And we wouldn't want that to be communicated. So we also want to think about, how do we intervene to reduce stress and increase understanding? So thinking about, how do parents understand their kids and their kids' behavior and their kids' responses, and how do we help parents reduce their stress level? Because that is going to be one of the best ways we can help families stay safe during this time, is to keep stress levels down and to help families feel competent and supported and connected to supports, whether that be systems supports or intervention supports, or it's family or other kinds of supports. Next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned, in my view, one of the best ways to keep children safe from exposure to domestic violence and child maltreatment is to intervene with the parents, and especially at a time like this that we're in right now, the high stress time with COVID-19. So assessing for and acknowledging the parents' own stress, right? So right now, this is a hugely stressful time for everyone, given what's going on in the world and in our country in particular. And so assessing for the stress levels related to that and acknowledging that stress is really needed. And then giving concrete coping strategies for how they can manage that stress, connecting them to various supports, like I said, that could be intervention, or just thinking about family members or who in their community could be of help. And then the last, helping them to understand things from their children's point of view. How are their children experiencing the situation? Next slide. All right, so let's take it to back to James and Mary Saul, right? So, and think about what is happening for them right now in the so they had a domestic violence incident, you know, just prior to the pandemic, and now you're assessing them during the time of the pandemic, and what is it that they're trying to handle right now? So at the individual and family level, James lost his job. He's unemployed at the moment, so he was laid off. Marisol is working, but she's working from home full time. Kaya is home without childcare. So she's trying to work from home while having no childcare. And then we have the 14-year-old who's doing virtual school, right, at home, trying to do her schoolwork from home. And then we have a crowded family living situation. So we have a good number of people living in a relatively small condo. And so they're having trouble finding space to work and having space to get done what they need to do. If we take it, you know, and so we're thinking about those are the individual, family, and the relationship level issues. And then if we think about the community and societal stresses that this family is also under, police violence happening in the community, both nationally and locally. We have repeated micro and macro aggressions that they experience, ongoing racism, you know, happening all the time, as well as the COVID-19 health-related inequities that are happening, that African American communities and minority communities are differentially impacted by the virus, both in terms of jobs and being on the front line, as well as greater incidence of actually contracting the virus, as well as lack of ability to get the health and treatment that they may need. So all of these stresses come together on this family, and we have to think about what are they dealing with right now. Next slide. So when you're assessing the stress level, you're assessing the things I mentioned in terms of what has happened and what stress level is the family under in their particular situation for them. And many of these things sound familiar to all of us right now, working from home, no childcare. These things are happening to a lot of people. So the nice thing about this is it's very easy to normalize that as a universal or generally universal experience, that we're under a very stressful situation in our country and in our communities right now. And so you can easily engage parents around that conversation as a universal, like, oh, how are you managing in particular? These are really difficult times. And then you want to assess a little further, you know, how is this stress level impacting everybody in the house, the parents in particular, but everybody in the house, everybody's sleeping, everybody's appetite and eating. Are people eating nutritious food? Are they getting enough exercise? What is the mood like? Are they feeling depressed, anxious, irritable? How are they interacting and getting along in the house? Are they feeling supported? Do they feel isolated and alone? So to try to understand how the particular stress is impacting each individual. And then what are you doing to relieve stress, right? What are they doing to help relieve stress? And yes, someone just mentioned about alcohol use, right? Like, are you using substances to cope? So how are you managing the stress, which sometimes is drinking more, right? Good, thank you. All right, next slide, Chandra.
So I want to highlight the beauty of this approach, because coming in, we're often focusing on behaviors and feelings. And so we might be coming in focusing on family violence or on challenges. And what Carla really has done is walked us through, if you think about it, what's the road that the family has traveled? And this, what I'm sharing here, is the child-parent psychotherapy triangle. So what have they been through? And really following that Samson mantra of, it's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. And while we very much want to address the violence and we want to have a good solid assessment of it, where we're really meeting individually with each caregiver, which is hard in the times of COVID and may require people to walk around the block so we can really hear about it, the beauty is that we're having a nuanced discussion about experience, what they're going through. And we're not saying, hey, you were violent, what can we do about this? We're saying, what are all the stressors that are impinging on you? And what are the stressors, not just in your family, but in the larger society, and that we're able to open the door to that, and in some ways to earn safety, to earn the right to be the people with whom you can get real and talk to about family violence, and building a bridge of understanding so that they might also be able to acknowledge, wow, we have so many stressors, and to be kinder to themselves. It makes sense. It's not good. We balance acceptance with change. It makes sense that we're having stress. It makes sense that we're arguing. And yet we'd like to change because it also isn't something that we want our daughter to grow up with. And so as we think about this, we can focus on Marisol, we could focus on James. Today we've chose to focus on James because of our work directly with fathers. And what we see and what he actually acknowledges in the course of the assessment is that he gets angry very easily, and that he has hit and fought when he gets angry. And we could parallel up and really think about what has he told us about his history. So he's told us about growing up in a home where his dad would get really angry, that there was violence in his home. He's told us about being incarcerated and not being able to really necessarily have the support for thinking about his emotions in that area, and that pattern of needing to toughen up, and he wants something different. He's talked to us about how he gets really worried when he thinks about not being in Kaya's life, right? And we want to also really assess for and remember positive experiences. Moments, we call them angel moments, moments of beauty with his own mom, with his own dad, that he also uses to raise Kaya, that those are beautiful things. Now, as we're addressing safety and we're thinking about safety currently, I wanted to share this picture to really highlight also within our intervention models how we address what we might call the psychodynamic aspects of safety. So if you look at this picture, you see a parent and a child walking down the road of life, and the clouds are meant to represent trauma, and so difficult things that have happened. And that we think about with some families, as they walk down the road of life, what we're concerned about is that there are scary monsters, there are things that continuously happen. And what we want to think about is how do we think about choosing a different road, or where those scary monsters come from, or what they want to do with them, really again focusing on what the family thinks and what the family wants. But very importantly, how do we pause and think about the road that they've traveled in the past, and how this has shaped their expectations about danger and safety? And how do we earn the right to really hear from them and to get real about what they want to do to get safer? How are they, let's imagine that James is continuing to drink, and Marisol very much loves him, but that when he drinks, there's increasing danger. How do we think about what is safe? Who is it safe to talk to? So we can think about protective action. What is Marisol's history that might also lead her to hold danger in a different way than we might want? And so how do we work with both caregivers when possible to develop an attitude where they're saying, I have grown up in a home where unfortunately there was danger, where people got upset. Maybe that's because of their history. Maybe it's because tracking back, it's because of historical trauma. But I would really like, and I deserve something different, and my child deserves something different. And that's a really different stance in a caregiver that we seek to strengthen. And it's not a head stance. It's really more of a gut stance. And so that's one of our goals in our treatment models. I'm going to go back to Carla.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. So I want to take just a couple of minutes to talk about some more specific kinds of approaches to intervening. And we're talking here about how we're intervening with James, but this also could be with Marisol with a different kind of case. So if we think about what happens, so let's say we've got, Kaya in a situation where she's being obstinate, right? She's not putting on her shoes to go somewhere, she's not listening, and the dad is experiencing that this is very stressful, and why doesn't she understand what I need her to do, right? And so what often happens is parents get overwhelmed by this stress in the situation. What you see is either some harsh over control, right, where they become more harsh and over controlling than we might like, or there's a passive withdrawal where they disengage from active parenting. And neither of those situations are particularly helpful. Next slide. So we see this really as a port of entry, where we can think about how to help the parent reflect on their experience in the moment of being stressed, and how that stress and feeling out of control can impact the way they're parenting their children, and how to better become aware of that so they can respond differently. Next slide. So if you take what we call a reflective functioning, sometimes people call it a mentalizing approach, what you're trying to help a parent do is first recognize and make sense of their emotions or experiences in that moment when they're dealing with their child, or their partner or somebody else in the family. How are they making sense of their emotions or their feelings of distress in that moment, that stressful moment? And then how can they recognize and make sense of the child's emotional distress, right? So you start with the parent, because when we're overwhelmed, it's very difficult for us to think about the needs of others. So start with yourself. What is your experience? And then once they understand their own experience, then they can better think about how their child might have experienced a particular event or circumstance. Next slide. So if we think about Kaya and we think about her being obstinate or not listening and following dad, what dad's asking for. Next slide. We want to think about, as a therapist, how do we engage with the frustrated parent to help him think about, or her think about, how to deal with an angry toddler or an obstinate toddler who's not listening. Next slide. So we might think, so if James is saying, this is really stressful and I just don't understand why she's not listening, you as a therapist might say something like, it sounds like you were feeling really frustrated, is that right? What was going through your mind during that moment? And the dad might say, well, yes, I was very frustrated. If I miss this job interview that I have, I'll have no chance at getting the job. And she knows that it's important. So there's this idea that the child knows that this job interview is really, really important. Next slide. So the therapist, you may say, so you were really worried about being late for the job interview, is that right? And then he says, yes, if I don't find work soon, we might lose our apartment. So now you hear the stress that's coming out, like what was going on for the dad. He was really stressed about this job interview and potentially being late or missing it. So then as a therapist, you can then go into more, right? Let's see if we can think more about what was going through your mind, right, during that moment. Next slide. And so she, you could say, and you wanted Kaya to cooperate and understand what was worrying you. What do you imagine she was thinking and feeling? And then he might then be able to say, oh, I don't know, she's just a baby. I guess she wanted to just play. She doesn't understand. So once the parent is calm enough to really be able to acknowledge and be heard in terms of the stress they were experiencing, they're often opened up to then be able to think more about more developmentally appropriate ways about the child. So then you could help the parent talk more about that. What do you think she doesn't understand? Why do you think playing is so meaningful to her right now? Right? Because toddlers like to play and they want to, if she has a great relationship with her dad and likes playing with him, she's going to want to play with him all the time. She's not going to want to put her shoes on or go be with her sister so dad can go to his job interview, right? So this is a way to try to first engage and think about the parent's experience and get them to talk about it and acknowledge that and empathize with it, and then help them think about the needs of their child or their partner, depending on the situation. Okay, next slide. So I want to spend just a couple of minutes also thinking about how I might talk to a dad about his stress reactivity and the way he's dealing with his stress in the moment. So I find if you're working with dads, I've also used this with moms. I've also used it with kids in slightly different ways. And it's nothing new. This is a way that we often work with people who are coming for trauma treatments all the time. But I like to talk to dads about how we have a stress continuum, and we have in our bodies a natural reaction to stressful situations. We have our fight or flight mode, and I'll talk to them about, okay, so when our body's in fight or flight mode, it means we're very stressed, we feel overwhelmed, and either we're preparing to fight, to stay and fight in a situation, or we're going to get out of there because we're too overwhelmed. And if it's really, really overwhelming and traumatizing, we might freeze up and not be able to respond at all. But our body has this automatic way of coming on and having our fight or flight response kick on. And what happens when we're in this fight or flight mode is our heart rate increases, we have rapid breathing, we don't communicate well, we get into this, we can become very agitated and also aggressive. And if we're continually under high levels of stress, we get into this mode called the survival struggle, where we're in this kind of very stressed, high intensity mode all the time. Next slide. And so I'll also talk about what happens to our brains during survival mode or during fight or flight. So I like to show, especially dads, a picture of the brain because they actually really seem to like hearing a medical explanation for things and why things are happening to their body, and that it's a natural reaction that happens to everyone. It takes the stigma out of their reactivity and helps them have an understanding of how their body's reacting. So when we go into fight or flight mode, when that part of our body is online, we have these three parts of our brain. We have the bottom part of our brain, which is the survival brain, this red part where the red dot is, and that's the animal part of our brain. It's the part of our brain that keeps our body functioning, keeps our physical body working. We have this middle part of our brain, the green part, which is the emotion part of our brain. That's where we process emotions and make sense of feelings and emotions. And then we have this top part of our brain called our thinking brain, the blue part. And that's the part that makes us human. It's the big juicy part that helps us make decisions and make intelligent choices all the time. So I think that you want to, so what happens when fight or flight mode comes on is that only these top two parts of our brain stop working. We're only functioning with our survival brain, our animal brain, which just goes into action. We can't process emotions clearly, we can't think clearly, we can't make good decisions. Next slide. So it's really important for parents to identify emotions and stress and to get back into control. So I'll talk to parents about that when you're in that fight or flight mode, the stress mode, we have to try to figure out how to get back in control of ourselves. And there are some really easy ways to do that that actually work. Next slide. And one of the key ways that we do that is by trying to breathe and try to relax. And that by doing these coping strategies, it brings our brain back online so we can think clearly. It makes us feel in control of our physical body, and it helps us get control of our reactions and emotions. So we're back in charge of ourselves and feeling good about our decisions. Next slide. So I will actually then teach the parents diaphragmatic breathing, which again is not new to anyone on this webinar, I'm sure. We all know how to do diaphragmatic breathing, but I often find that parents are not really that bought into it, particularly men. If they feel like it's, they feel like it's kind of a flowery, like yoga, touchy-feely thing. So when I talk about it, I always talk about what's happening in the body and what's happening to their brains and how this breathing turns on what we call their parasympathetic nervous system, which is the relaxation side of their nervous system, and it puts them back in control of their bodies. So I'll talk about the two sides of the nervous system, the fight or flight side and the relaxation side. And how we turn on the relaxation side is by doing this special kind of breathing. And I even say you may have been taught how to breathe before, but this way is a very particular way that helps you get back in the driver's seat. So it's really important, and I think we can all do this together because we can all use some nice deep breaths during these very stressful times. So we want to breathe in through your nose, and you want to pause and breathe out through your mouth. And it's really important that you don't take shallow chest breaths, which is what you do when you're in stress mode. You want to take very deep breaths to get the air all the way down into your stomach. So breathe in through your nose. Hold it, breathe out through your mouth. Now I'm going to do it as a count. Breathe in through your nose. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Breathe out through your mouth. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. In through your nose. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Out through your mouth. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I always talk to parents about making sure they breathe out longer than they breathe in and really push all the air out. And it really is bringing oxygen to your body and to your brain and helping get your thinking brain back online. And you only need to do it 3 to 5 times to start to really feel the difference. So I know you all have different ways of doing diaphragmatic breathing. You may have found some that work better for you than the one I'm showing you, but it's really key to try to engage parents in thinking about why it works for them and why they might want to try it. And I've found this way of explaining it to be helpful even for people who've kind of poo-pooed the idea of breathing because they've been told about it before and it doesn't work for them. And I usually feel like when it doesn't work for you, it's because you aren't doing it correctly and you're not practicing it at times that you're not stressed. Next slide. So a couple other quick things before we turn it over to Chandra. These are some other ways to try to help parents slow down and regulate. these are all things that probably folks are familiar with, helping parents think about how they can take space for themselves so that they could potentially do those breaths if they need some space to calm down, using mindfulness techniques, grounding techniques that engage their senses, using ice or putting their hands in cold water or running their hands under alternating cold and warm water are some that I find that dads and parents really can get into easily. But you also can do things like coloring, diamond art, anything that really focuses your attention on the here and now. Are nice relaxation stress management strategies. I also talk with parents always about exercise as a natural mood booster and a way to expel agitation and stress and irritability, and help them problem solve what kinds of exercise they can get depending on where they live, the community they're in, and their environment, because what I can do may not be something that's safe or possible for them. Next slide.
Great, so I'm just going to wrap us up with a few resources. We know that when we work with young children, one of the ways to help both them and their parents is through books. And so really a healthy diet of different books that honor feelings, where we think about with COVID, with all those stressors, it makes sense that we're carrying a lot inside our bodies. And that these are books that honor those feelings and help people to name them. And also Angry Octopus has a little bit of the breathing exercise that Carla has shared. We also have a free COVID-related story developed with our NC National Child Traumatic Stress Network colleagues. Somebody asked, are these books in Spanish? And I just wanted to note that on the very bottom, I put a link to our Pinterest boards where we have books in Spanish and also the books in English. And this is a free COVID-related book that we developed with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network that focuses on family stress as related to COVID and from also the need to stay at home. And so this is in English, Spanish, simplified Chinese, traditional Chinese, and multiple other versions, and is available for free. So just to wrap up, when we think about really how do we lessen the impact of family stress and reduce the risk of family violence, one of the things that we do is we help people to talk about their stress from multiple sources, and we validate and normalize that. We also think about how do they reduce stress by setting up routines, by having those stress relief activities. We want people to be able to have grounding exercises, and also the concept that we don't need to get stuck in feelings. So if you are somebody who grew up where when you get angry, when you get sad, you really feel that, you know, in some ways all hell breaks loose or there's a tremendous amount of loss associated with that, these simple things like hobbies, art, exercises, you know, doing exercise really show you that you can have a feeling and then you can transform it and not get stuck. And that is a beautiful lesson that most parents really want to pass on to their children. We didn't talk as much about it, but we do want to get into the practical information about, you know, James, he's having some employment struggles. And so how do we connect them to real world supports? So I just want to thank you all for being here. We know that this is also hard on providers during this time of COVID. We're seeing a lot of families where there aren't a lot of resources, and that we know that we often also carry this. So in some ways, when Carla is doing the breathing or when we are sharing about all these different stressors, we know that these are stressors that we all carry as well. And so we want to acknowledge that, normalize that, and also just looking at all the people who've joined, know that we are not alone in this work that we do to support vulnerable families. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you both so much, Chandra and Carla. This has been incredibly helpful and a lot of great information. I know, Carla, you referenced the chat box was moving quickly at one point, and I think that's a great sign that people are actively engaged. So we've had a couple of questions come in through the Q&A pod, so let me just relay those to you all. And then participants, please feel free to keep sending those questions. The first is any suggestions on how to best work with families that don't meet criteria for DCFS/CPS and are not mandated to receive services but decline services? So anyone that doesn't meet the criteria for CPS intervention.
Do you want to go, or do you want
So
me?
we work with a lot of those families. I think anytime that we're called in, it's an opportunity to think with them about, you know, what the benefits of talking, you know, so I'm just thinking about, imagine that James and Marisol did not meet criteria. If we really earned James's trust, he would talk about, and Marisol would also talk about their family history. And they have a very young child, and they are likely trying to partner together to raise her, taking what's good from their family, but also breaking a cycle of intergenerational family violence and trauma. And to the degree that they feel like we would be helpful, strengths-based, supportive, they might invite us to be able to be people who think with them about both what Kaya has witnessed and how to help move beyond, and how they want to parent differently, maybe from what they received.
Thank you, that's great. There's a couple more questions I'll relay. I also want to remind participants that we will show a link to a survey at the very end of the presentation. So if everyone can stay on to get that link, that would be fantastic. Next question, what if we work within an organization where the approach is more service focused? How can we still advocate for the victim focused approach?
I think that's a great question. I mean, I think that's something to think about within your agency in some ways, but I think there are ways that you can follow your agency's general guidance while also really trying to partner with the family and keeping the family in mind, trying to understand what the individual family wants and needs, and then being able to bring that information back. I think it's partially about the way you approach the parents in terms of trying to think about how you're partnering with them. You want to help them have the life that they want, you know, how they envision things to go, and try to understand what it is they're seeking and what they would find helpful. You know, I think when you're in an agency that really has a very specific, like, this is how you do things, like to be able to bring this back and say, well, you know, I talked to this parent and I'm partnered, try to understand with them what it is they're wanting and how could we potentially work with this and try to go, you know, help them meet this goal. I mean, there are certain mandates that we have to do as providers, right? Like there's certain things that come to a certain level and we have to make a child protection report because that's, you know, we're mandated to do so. So there are certain things we can't get around. But I think that as much as you can try to partner with the parent to really understand what they want, then you can bring that back to your supervisor or to your agency and try to talk through like, well, what would happen if we did it this way, or how might we approach this in a different kind of way? I don't know, Chandra, if you have other ideas.
Yeah, I think that it's critical that across our systems we really adopt trauma-informed approaches. Mm-hmm. And one thing that we know is that trauma involves being kind of overwhelmed and having stuff done to you. And so really taking a stance that any approach that replays that is not going to be therapeutic.
Yes.
It has to really be something where you're making a choice. If you're feeling done to, then that's actually adding trauma. Mm-hmm. So how do we start off with that stance? And then there's some really basic things. I think like SAMHSA has really been an advocate for client-centered approaches and for organizations really elevating the voice of consumers. So how do we share power? How do we say, look, let's hire people, let's share funding, let's have people who can tell us what they think when they're not under us, but when there are equals. And so the more organizations that have consumers, not just as advisors, but as true partners, that would also go a long way as we look at, you know, what are our attrition rates? What are the rates to which people come back to us? Do they feel safe with us? How are we collecting those data? So those are all, I think, steps that we need to take, and we honestly need our funding sources to advocate for that, to advocate to giving the power in a way I'd actually like the consumers to have the dollars to spend. You have this amount of dollars. Who do you want to spend it on?
Both. We do have a couple of other questions, but we're approaching the top of the hour, so I want to make sure that we get the last wrap-up information to our participants. Participants, just so you know, I can reiterate again, we will send out a document with all of the themes of the questions that have surfaced. All have been great questions, really wonderful engagement, and we will be sure to get you answers to those questions. So feel free to continue to send them as we wrap up. Chandra, could you advance to the next slide for me? So as I mentioned in the intro, this event has been a part of an entire series in which we are focused on preventing and responding to family violence during COVID-19 with the National Child Trauma Stress Network. It's a part of a 4-part series. You'll see the next session will be this time next week, Tuesday, July 21st at the same time. And that session specifically will be addressing family conflict in the time of COVID-19. Information on how to register for the remaining sessions will be included in the follow-up email that we send in the next few days. Next slide, please. As I also mentioned in the introduction, because we received SAMHSA funding to put on today's event, we're required to submit data related to the quality of this event. We ask that you please take a moment to complete this very brief survey about today's session, and we will also send you that link in our follow-up email as well. The follow-up email will not include this QR code, so if you're interested in using the QR code for all the techies out there, please do that now. Otherwise, you'll get a link to that. I'm not one that usually uses it. So I'm impressed with other people that can. And another reminder to our participants, we will be sending out that post-event email over the next few days that will have copies of the slides. Everybody has been very impressed by your slides, that content, as well as a recording of the event, which will be posted on the National MHTTC Network Coordinating Office's website. And we will get out those questions that you all have asked. They've been fantastic. So thank you again, Chandra and Carla. I so appreciate you sharing your expertise with everyone. People seem very excited about the topic and engaged. And thank you, participants, for joining us. We hope to have you in future events.